So here's where I'm at with my piece, and a lot of my basting's been pulled out and it's getting a little bit baggy in the unstitched areas, a little bit tighter in the stitched areas. So as I'm stitching, I won't allow everything to get pushed one way and create puckers unless they're obviously deliberate. I would do deliberate puckers in a design, but I wouldn't do accidental ones. Okay, so here's my picture, and I'm going to stitch the whole sky now and the reflection, and I've got these flaps to either pull back or stitch along the way. And I usually just, as I'm thinking through, there are a lot of things I just do, and I sit down and I'm planning to just stitch the whole sky, and then I realize, oh, maybe for some reason I decide I'm going to stitch this one part of this tree and then enough of this so that it can be trimmed, or perhaps I think I'll just stitch part of this, pull it all back, whatever. And what I'm thinking about is what overlaps what and how I think it'll look and what parts of my picture I could create otherwise. Oh, I never noticed this nice bit of blue here that matches that. I have to think about whether or not I want to try to do anything with that. In stitching the sky and the reflection, we can make this as simple or as complicated as we want. We could just stitch each area pretty plainly with a stipple and then cut along the stippling to make our shapes, and it would still be beautiful. And because our ace in the hole with this kind of work is that free motion quilting is beautiful. And so even when its beauty is just in its simplicity, it's beautiful. And so we can do that. And the other reason to do something like that is that our eyes really do like white space. Our eyes like somewhere where they can rest and not have quite so much to do. I used to know someone whose husband used to say when he looked at things, it certainly gives the eye a lot to do, which is hilarious. But you can see that he didn't really appreciate busy things. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 areas plus this and a reflection to deal with. And so even if we did just stitch those with a plain stipple and then cut along the edge of it, I think we could have something very beautiful because free motion quilting is inherently beautiful. My plan is to break those areas down a little bit more, have a little bit more going on, a little more to look at when you get close. And then, of course, whatever I do up here, I'm going to echo it down here. But it'll be much smaller. And even though I'll try to stick to the same thread colors, whatever I use up there, I'll try to put it down here. I am not going to do the stitching the same. This I want to be a watery version of the stitching. One of the first things that I want to do is look at my overlap. Another reason that we have this all over batik on this is not only to stabilize it as we're working, but then we don't have to worry unless we poke through when we're cutting and expose batting. We don't have to worry about going down too far. But I like to mark my overlap with chalk, and so that I make sure that I don't accidentally do what I'm not planning to do. I'm hoping that what I do will be somewhat purposeful. And I can see here that this overlap isn't completely straight. But I'm not too worried about that being precise. So I'm going to kind of draw, and that's not exact. Obviously, this chalk line is not exact, but it gives me a pretty good idea. I don't think it's here or here. You know, it gives me a good idea, and it does get wider, I think, as it goes this way. So the first thing to decide is, am I trying to have it be a complete overlap so that none of the light blue shows? Am I trying to not let any of that show, or do I actually think having a little bit of that show would be nice? I don't know if you can see very well from where you are, but this is very deep blue here, and then there's a very light blue here, and then there's the pink, and then here's light blue. So there is a bit of light blue here. And so I have a plan, and I take a picture of the thread colors I've picked out for the various areas so I can refer back as I work. First, I sketch and then stitch scrolls in brown variegated thread. Of course, I run out of bobbin thread immediately, and so I start back up with the same color in the variegation. Sometimes when I get to the end of a scroll, I'll move around the end and come down the other side, just depending on how I want it to be shaped. I keep moving to avoid pile-ups. If I have to stop to take a breather or think things through, it's better than stitching in one place. And I'm always prepared to slow down and finesse the fabric a little to discourage puckers that are trying to form. Minor issues like this pucker should look fine after the wash. Also, when you're this close to the edge of your fabric, you have a few more issues with puckering. Next, I remember to sketch the watery scrolls below in the reflection, and then I stitch them while I'm still threaded up with the brown, and I achieve the wateriness by just jiggling the fabric a little as I sort of quilt the same scrolls. I'm not worried about this being super precise, but I do want to create the impression of the reflection. Next, I stipple around the scrolls with orange thread. First, I sketch with chalk to remind myself to leave voids and not to make it too boring of a shape. Two things about this. When I can't come in from the side, I start and end with a little circle when I'm doing just regular stippling. Also, I try to start quilting near settled territory where it's already quilted down. I don't start out in the wilderness and then work my way towards the area that's quilted and find that I've got a lot of puckers. In fact, you'll create puckers that way. So I start by something quilted and go on from there. It doesn't take long before I kind of wish I picked a thread with more contrast for the stippling. This is a little difficult though because I want the brown scrolls to really pop off of the pink, and then I want the stippling to pop off as well, and having them both do that is sort of difficult. I think this pink is sort of a medium value. White or light yellow thread may have worked better than this variegated orange. I trim the fabric as quickly as I can. I do a rough cut now and can fine-tune more later. I really like the way the stippling looks trimmed up. The texture when the fairy frost catches the light makes me feel happy. Sometimes the best way to cut the fabric is to use the curved scissors to poke through the top layer of fabric to start cutting. The embroidery scissors that I prefer have a slightly finer tip for this purpose compared to the craft scissors, making this job a little easier because you don't have to stab through the fabric with a blunt point. I don't know if you can see the difference here. It is easy to occasionally poke through an extra layer which exposes batting. If we do that accidentally, then we have something to fix, but it does get easier with practice. I hardly ever do that by accident anymore. Anyway, next I quilt the reflection, remembering to jiggle my fabric a little to keep it watery looking. I am planning to add one more element to these scrolls. At the very end, if things go the way I plan, I'll do a little bobbin drawing. Hopefully it will add contrast and also demonstrate bobbin drawing and how you can use an already quilted design to guide you where you place your bobbin play. I stitch a little on the pink fabric between my peacock feather bushes, and then I quickly trim the pink reflection as well. I think it's coming right along. Next, I'm going to stitch peacock feathers on the dark blue fabric with yellow variegated thread. I mark with chalk to remind myself to expose some of the sky blue fabric in the process. I'll end up trimming it along the edge where the pink is trimmed. I leave the blue fabric that I trim a little long, hoping I will like the effect once it is washed. Sometimes I trim out the centers of the peacock feathers. If I decide to do that, it will be later. Right now I want to keep moving. I remember this little bit of blue in the sky and decide to add one peacock feather to peek out behind a tree. I use painter's tape to keep my fingers well away from the needle as I stitch, and then I remove the tape and trim the shape. Here I am testing my stitch using a decorative stitch to free motion. My machine is dialed to one of its presets and set to a narrow zigzag. This gives me just enough wiggle in my needle to help give my peacock feathers that watery look in the reflection. With my machine set this way, I don't worry too much about the exact placement of the feathers. I also take a minute to stitch a little bit in the bushes. Then I move on to my sun, which I keep thinking should look like a citrus slice. I have no idea if this will look silly, but I stitch it and trim it, and then I also do the reflection. As always, I use a half clothespin when I need to manage my fabric a little near the needle without putting my fingers in danger. I decide to stitch 4 white flowers in the sky blue batik. I have a plan, but I'm not sure it will come to anything. I'm using white thread in my top and bobbin. I'm drawing my flower centers with disappearing ink. I think the flowers need to be a bit flowy, not too plump or perky for what I'm thinking of. We'll see how it works out. After stitching 4 in the sky, I stitch 3 in the water. I try to place them similarly, but squash them a little vertically and make them look a little watery. Often in making wall hangings, I've experienced a period of self-doubt, or the blahs, when I start to fear it may not work out. This might be time to take a little break before forging ahead. But if the problem will be solved by doing the work and putting it behind me, I may just push forward, which is why I stitch out the sky as quickly as I can. In the small area between the blue peacock feathers and pink scrolls, I use blue variegated thread, as you can see here. My plan is to bring neighboring colors into the light blue sky areas using variegated threads and a stitch pattern I call cell walls, which sort of divides an area into compartments. As a convenience, often when I change thread, I clip above the cone, tie my new thread to my old thread, and pull it through to the needle. Since my needle is a 14 and thread is very thin, often I can actually pull the knot through the eye of my needle. I can lift the thread out of my tension discs to avoid them or just pull the knot through. Note that I pull back my planted tree fabrics each time to quilt under them. Next, I use orange variegated thread to quilt all along the horizon and in the reflection. I can't say that I like my lemon slices much. I hope having more going on the horizon will tone them down a little. I'm hopping around a bit without pulling up threads, so at the end I clip all my loose top and bobbin threads at once. Anytime I hop around, I make sure the little arm with the hole in it, called the thread take-up lever, is raised all the way into the position that frees my bobbin thread before starting back up. If I were causing rats' nests all over my back, I would avoid this technique. Next, I use variegated pink and quilt below my scrolls and around my white flowers. Note that I'm still pulling back my black tree fabrics to quilt underneath them. I leave a few voids and smooth my fabric as needed to avoid puckers. I tend to work from quilted areas into empty areas, not the other way around. I quilt in the reflection a bit too. If I had a bunch of loose pieces of fabric at this point, I would be managing puckers, but this is pretty smooth sailing. So I've sped this way up to avoid wasting your time. When I'm done, I will have essentially 100% coverage of my wall piece, but I am going for a little bit more, maybe 110%. Which we'll do in the next video addressing trees, bushes, early embellishments, and detailing. The first thing I'll cover is my thought process as I'm adding additional plant life. But first let's check in on the mini to see what we can learn from that. In this case, I stitched the planted tree fabrics before working any of the sky. I used the same variegated teal thread that I use here on my far shore as well as on my full size. I quickly trim these up and move on. Next, I stitch all the bluest areas with variegated blue thread, like this. Then I stitched the sunburst with white top and bobbin threads. I follow that up with orange variegated thread on some of the cloudy areas of the sky. Unfortunately, I'm seeing some pileups of my bobbin thread on top of my piece. I use disappearing ink to mark areas to mimic in the water. I quickly stitch these and then move on to stippling the remaining sky and water with canary yellow thread. It's coming along nicely.